The unequal tray. Amara Johnson walked into the bustling cafeteria of Greenfield Middle School, her stomach growling in anticipation of lunch. The room was filled with the familiar sounds of trays clattering, students laughing, and the occasional hiss of the lunch lady admonishing a rowdy group of boys. It was another ordinary day, or so she thought. Amara joined the lunch line, chatting with her friends Zoe and Malik, who were joking about their math teacher's obsession with pop quizzes. As the line moved forward, Amara noticed something peculiar. The trays being handed out to the students ahead of her seemed generous and well-balanced. Vibrant greens, plump chicken breasts, and fluffy mashed potatoes were placed on their trays with care. When it was her turn, however, something changed. The cafeteria worker, Mrs. Harding, a stern woman with salt and pepper hair, barely glanced at Amara before slapping a pitiful portion of wilted lettuce onto her tray. The lettuce was brown at the edges, and the mashed potatoes resembled glue more than food. Finally, Mrs. Harding added a small dry meat patty, one that looked far past its prime. Next, Mrs. Harding barked, not even meeting Amara's eyes. Amara hesitated, staring down at her tray. Her stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with unease. She turned to glance at Zoe, whose tray was heaped with fresh vegetables, steaming rice, and golden chicken tenders. Zoe noticed Amara's tray and frowned. "That's all you got?" Zoe asked, her voice low but laced with concern. Amara shrugged, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Maybe they ran out of the good stuff," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. As they sat down to eat, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She poked at her lettuce with her fork, the leaves crumbling under her touch. The mashed potatoes were cold, and the meat patty smelled faintly sour. She glanced around the cafeteria, her eyes landing on Mrs. Harding, who was now serving Malik. He received a plate piled high with food. "Guess I just got unlucky," Amara said with a forced smile, trying to brush it off. But Zoe wasn't convinced. The next day, the same thing happened. This time, Zoe and Malik were paying close attention. They watched as Mrs. Harding handed other students generous portions, but gave Amara the same stale, unappetizing meal as the day before. Zoe's brows furrowed, and Malik exchanged a troubled look with her. "I don't think this is random, Amara," Zoe said softly after lunch. "Why does she always give you the worst food?" Amara shrugged again, her discomfort growing. "I don't know. Maybe it's just a coincidence." But it wasn't a coincidence. Over the next week, the pattern became undeniable. Mrs. Harding always served Amara smaller portions of older, less appetizing food, while her classmates received fresh and generous servings. The difference was stark, and Amara's friends couldn't ignore it. One Friday afternoon, as they sat in the library finishing a group project, Zoe finally voiced what they had all been thinking. "I don't think she's just picking on you for no reason, Amara," Zoe said, her voice tense. "I think it's because you know." She hesitated, her gaze flickering downward. "Because you're black." Amara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The thought had crossed her mind, but she had pushed it aside, unwilling to believe it could be true. Discrimination was something she read about in history class, not something that happened to her in real life, or so she had thought. "No," Amara said quickly, shaking her head. "That can't be it. She probably just doesn't like me." Zoe looked unconvinced. "But why wouldn't she like you? You've never done anything to her, and it's not just about liking someone or not. It's about how she treats you differently. That's not okay." Amara wanted to argue, but deep down, she knew Zoe was right. The weight of the realization settled heavily on her chest. She thought about all the times she had ignored the smirks Mrs. Harding gave her, or the way the woman's tone seemed harsher when speaking to her compared to other students. The spark of defiance. By the following Monday, Amara's unease had transformed into a simmering anger. She replayed the moments in her mind. The wilted lettuce, the sneers, the pitiful portions. Her friend's words echoed in her ears. "It's not okay. You don't deserve this." That day, Amara resolved to say something. As she approached the lunch counter, her hands trembled, but she gripped her tray tightly, forcing herself to stand tall. When Mrs. Harding handed her the usual pitiful meal, Amara cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Why do I always get less food than everyone else?" Mrs. Harding froze for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Amara. Then, a smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it," she said curtly. "Plenty of kids would be grateful for what they're given." Amara's cheeks burned with humiliation and anger. The woman's words weren't just dismissive. They were dripping with condescension, as if Amara should be grateful for the scraps she was being served. The other students in line fell silent, their eyes darting between Amara and Mrs. Harding. "Why do you treat me differently?" Amara pressed, her voice louder now. "I see what you give the other kids. It's not fair." Mrs. Harding's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Move along," she snapped. "You're holding up the line." Amara hesitated, her hands trembling. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her courage faltered under the weight of Mrs. Harding's disdainful gaze. Slowly, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she sat down at her usual table, her anger didn't fade. If anything, it burned brighter. She noticed Zoe discreetly holding her phone under the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. Amara knew what that meant. Her friend was documenting everything. Zoe leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to do something, Amara. This isn't just about you. This is bigger than that." Amara nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know exactly what they would do or how they would do it, but one thing was clear. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Something had to change. Evidence and allies. The next day, the atmosphere in the cafeteria was different. Amara could feel it as soon as she walked in. Whispers followed her as she moved to the lunch line, her tray clutched tightly in her hands. She caught snippets of conversations, students murmuring about her confrontation with Mrs. Harding the day before. Some sounded curious, others dismissive, but a few voices carried tones of support. For the first time, Amara realized she wasn't as alone as she had thought. At her usual table, Zoe was already seated, her phone discreetly resting on her lap. She had spent the night combing through the videos she'd recorded over the past week, meticulously documenting Mrs. Harding's treatment of Amara compared to other students. She had also captured the moment Amara stood up for herself. The footage was undeniable, a clear and painful illustration of bias. "I have everything," Zoe whispered as Amara sat down. She slid her phone across the table, the screen playing a muted clip of Mrs. Harding, slapping a small portion of wilted vegetables onto Amara's tray. "Look at this. It's not just your portions. It's her attitude. She looks so annoyed just handing you food." Amara stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. Seeing the injustice through Zoe's eyes made it feel even more real. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Zoe leaned in, her expression determined. "We share it. People need to see this. If we don't, nothing will change." Amara hesitated. The idea of going public terrified her. What if people didn't believe her? What if it only made things worse? But then she remembered Mrs. Harding's smirk, the condescension in her voice, and the humiliation she felt every time she received a tray of subpar food. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it." The post that changed everything. That afternoon, after school, Amara and Zoe sat on Zoe's bed, huddled over her laptop. They edited the clips together, creating a short but impactful video that told Amara's story. The video showed Mrs. Harding serving generous portions to other students, followed by the stark contrast of Amara's meager, unappetizing tray. Zoe added captions to highlight key moments, like Mrs. Harding's dismissive remarks and the expressions on her face. At the end of the video, Amara recorded a message. She sat in front of Zoe's phone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. It's about fairness. It's about making sure no one else has to feel like they're less than anyone else. I don't want to be treated better than anyone else. I just want to be treated the same. And I think that's something we all deserve. When the video was done, Zoe uploaded it to social media with the caption, "This is what happens when we stay silent. #Justice for Amara." They watched as the post went live. A small pebble dropped into the vast ocean of the internet. The viral outrage. By the next morning, the video had spread further than either of them could have imagined. Amara's phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, likes, comments, and shares pouring in from friends, classmates, and even strangers. The hashtag Justice for Amara began trending locally, and by lunchtime, it had reached national attention. The comments were a mix of outrage and support. "This is disgusting. How is this allowed in a school? Amara, you're so brave for speaking up. This is why we need more accountability in schools. Enough is enough." But not everyone was supportive. Some comments were dismissive, accusing Amara of overreacting or seeking attention. Others were outright hateful, filled with veiled racism and vitriol. Amara tried to focus on the positive messages, but the negativity gnawed at her confidence. At school, the atmosphere was electric. Students whispered in the hallways, and Amara noticed more eyes on her than ever before. Some students offered encouraging smiles or quiet words of support, while others avoided her altogether. Even the teachers seemed on edge, their usual chatter replaced by tense, hushed tones. When Amara entered the cafeteria, the room fell silent. All eyes turned toward her as she made her way to the lunch line. Mrs. Harding was there, her face pale and tight-lipped. For the first time, she didn't meet Amara's gaze. Instead, she wordlessly handed Amara a tray, one that was, shockingly, piled high with fresh, steaming food. Amara hesitated, staring down at the tray in disbelief. Around her, students murmured in surprise. Zoe, sitting at their usual table, pulled out her phone to document the moment. Amara turned to look at Mrs. Harding, who was already turning away, her expression unreadable. The injustice wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, Amara felt like she had power. Her voice had been heard, and the world was listening. The school's response. By the end of the week, the video had reached the local news. Reporters swarmed the school, their cameras capturing shots of students walking to class and parents protesting outside the main entrance. The administration, blindsided by the sudden scrutiny, scrambled to respond. Principal Carter called an emergency assembly, his voice shaky as he addressed the student body. "We are aware of the concerns raised by recent events," he began, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Please know that we take these allegations very seriously. An investigation is already underway, and we are committed to ensuring that all students feel safe and valued." His words were met with a mixture of applause and skepticism. Amara sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel Zoe's reassuring presence beside her, but it did little to calm her nerves. The principal's promises sounded hollow, a desperate attempt to save face. After the assembly, Amara was called into a meeting with Principal Carter and the district superintendent. Her parents accompanied her, their faces stern and resolute. "Amara," the superintendent began, his tone carefully measured, "we want to apologize for the way you've been treated. This situation should never have occurred, and we are committed to making things right." Amara nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about me," she said firmly. "What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" The superintendent looked momentarily taken aback, but he quickly recovered. "We're implementing mandatory diversity training for all staff and creating a system where students can anonymously report concerns. We're also reviewing our hiring practices to ensure that our staff reflects the diversity of our student body." It was a start, but Amara knew there was still a long way to go. She left the meeting feeling a mix of hope and skepticism. Words were easy, but actions were harder. Building momentum, As the school year continued, Amara's fight for justice transformed into a larger movement. Students rallied around her, organizing protests and petitioning for broader changes. They demanded not only accountability for Mrs. Harding, but also a deeper look at the school's policies and culture. Amara found herself at the center of it all, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. What had started as a personal struggle had become a powerful call for change, a movement that would ripple far beyond the walls of Greenfield Middle School. The movement grows. The viral video was just the beginning. Amara's story, now shared and reshared across platforms, sparked a surge of activism among students, parents, and community members. What had started as a quiet injustice within the walls of Greenfield Middle School was rapidly becoming the centerpiece of a much larger conversation about discrimination, fairness, and the role of institutions in perpetuating inequality. Amara sat at her kitchen table one evening, her laptop open and notifications flooding her phone. The messages were overwhelming. Hundreds of strangers expressing support, sharing similar experiences, or simply thanking her for speaking up. But there were darker messages, too. Threats, insults, and hateful rhetoric that made her stomach churn. Her mother, Denise, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to read all of these, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Focus on the good. Those other people, they're just scared of change." Amara nodded, though the knot in her chest didn't loosen. She wanted to focus on the positive, but the weight of the negativity was hard to ignore. Still, the thought of backing down never crossed her mind. If anything, the hate only strengthened her resolve. The Student Coalition. By the end of the week, students had organized a coalition, calling themselves Voices for Equality. The group met after school in the library, a diverse mix of kids from different grades and backgrounds. Amara was hesitant at first, unsure of how to lead such a group, but Zoe and Malik reassured her. "This is your moment, Amara," Zoe said. "People are looking to you because you're brave enough to speak up." "I don't even know what to say," Amara admitted. "Just tell the truth," Malik said simply. "That's why we're all here, because you told the truth, and we're tired of pretending it doesn't matter." The first meeting buzzed with energy. Students shared their own experiences with unfair treatment, from subtle slights to blatant discrimination. One girl, Priya, described how she had been excluded from advanced classes despite having top grades. Another student, Jamal, talked about being unfairly disciplined compared to his white peers. Amara listened, her heart aching with the weight of their stories. She realized that her experience wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long. "We need to do more than talk about this," Priya said. "We need action." Amara nodded. "Then let's make a list of demands. We'll take it to the principal, the school board, whoever will listen." They spent hours brainstorming, drafting proposals, and assigning tasks. By the end of the night, they had a plan. They would hold a school-wide rally to present their demands and raise awareness. Amara would be the keynote speaker. The rally. The day of the rally dawned bright and clear. Students poured into the gymnasium, their energy palpable. Signs bearing slogans like "Equal Rights, Equal Respect," and "Justice for All Students" lined the walls. Teachers and staff stood at the edges of the room, their expressions ranging from supportive to wary. Amara stood behind the podium, her heart pounding as she surveyed the crowd. She spotted her parents in the front row, their faces filled with pride. Zoe gave her a thumbs up from the side of the stage, and Malik nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Amara stepped forward. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I first spoke up about what was happening to me, I didn't know if anyone would care. I thought maybe I was overreacting, or that no one would believe me. But I've learned something important in the past few weeks. When one of us speaks out, it gives others the courage to do the same." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about making sure every student feels valued, respected, and treated fairly. It's about changing the system that has ignored and hurt too many people for too long." The crowd erupted into applause, and Amara felt a surge of confidence. She went on to outline their demands: mandatory diversity training for staff, transparent policies for addressing complaints, and a more inclusive curriculum that celebrated the contributions of all cultures and histories. When she finished, the room exploded with cheers and chants. Amara stepped back from the podium, her cheeks flushed with emotion. For the first time, she felt not just like a victim, but like a leader. Resistance and allies. The rally's success didn't go unnoticed. The school board issued a statement acknowledging the students' concerns and promising to review their demands. But not everyone was supportive. A small but vocal group of parents and community members began pushing back, accusing the students of exaggerating the problem and stirring up unnecessary trouble. Amara's family received anonymous letters and phone calls, some supportive but others filled with hateful messages. Her father, James, was particularly worried. "This is bigger than we thought," he said one evening. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Amara found unlikely allies among the school staff. Mr. Patel, the counselor, approached her after the rally to offer his support. "You're doing something important, Amara," he said. "If you need someone to back you up with the administration, I'm here." Even a few teachers who had initially been skeptical began to change their tune. Mrs. Rivers, Amara's history teacher, started incorporating lessons on civil rights and social justice into her curriculum. "Your bravery has inspired me," she told Amara one day after class. But the resistance was strong. Mrs. Harding, who had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, denied any wrongdoing. In a local news interview, she claimed she was being unfairly targeted and accused the students of misinterpreting her actions. The backlash hurt, but Amara refused to back down. "If we give up now, nothing will change," she told Zoe and Malik during one of their coalition meetings. "We have to keep pushing." The community awakens. As the weeks passed, the movement grew beyond the school. Local churches, community organizations, and even nearby schools began to join the fight. Parents organized a town hall meeting to discuss the issues raised by Amara's video and the rally. The meeting was packed, with people spilling out into the hallway. Amara sat on the panel alongside Zoe, Malik, and Mr. Patel. As they shared their experiences and proposed solutions, the audience listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, their skepticism evident. But by the end of the night, it was clear that the community was paying attention. "I never realized how much my silence contributed to the problem," one parent admitted during the Q&A session. "Thank you for opening my eyes." Amara left the town hall feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. The toll of leadership. Despite the momentum, the pressure took a toll on Amara. She struggled to keep up with schoolwork, friendships, and her newfound role as a leader. Late one night, as she worked on a speech for an upcoming school board meeting, her mother found her slumped over her desk, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," Amara whispered. "It's too much." Her mother knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight hug. "You don't have to do this alone, Amara," she said. "You have people who believe in you, who want to help. Let them." With her parents' encouragement, Amara began leaning on her coalition more, delegating tasks and trusting her team. Slowly, she found a balance, learning to navigate the challenges of leadership without losing herself in the process. The fight for accountability. The morning was quiet when Amara arrived at school, but a tension hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Over the weekend, the school board had concluded its investigation into Mrs. Harding's actions. A statement was expected that day, and everyone, from students to parents to faculty, was waiting to hear what the decision would be. Amara walked to her locker, her movements deliberate, her shoulders squared. She had spent the weekend preparing herself for any outcome. Beside her, Zoe and Malik flanked her like guards, their expressions a mix of apprehension and determination. I heard the principal is holding a staff meeting first thing, Malik whispered as they stopped by Amara's locker. Apparently, Mrs. Harding's been called in. Zoe frowned. They better not sweep this under the rug. If they try, we'll go even harder. Amara nodded, her jaw tightening. No matter what happens, we keep pushing. This isn't just about her, it's about the system. The statement. By mid-morning, Principal Carter's voice crackled over the intercom. Attention, students and staff. I want to take a moment to address recent concerns regarding our cafeteria services and staff conduct. After a thorough investigation, we have determined that there were serious breaches of policy and conduct. Effective immediately, Mrs. Harding will no longer be employed at Greenfield Middle School. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. In classrooms and hallways, students exchanged glances, some cheering, others quietly nodding in approval. But Principal Carter wasn't finished. We recognize that this issue reflects deeper problems within our school's culture and policies. To that end, we will be implementing new training programs for all staff, revising our complaint procedures, and establishing a student advisory council to ensure all voices are heard. Thank you. Amara felt a wave of emotions, relief that Mrs. Harding was being held accountable, but also apprehension. Words were easy, but actions were harder. Would the school follow through on these promises? The backlash. Though the school's response was a victory for Amara and her coalition, it also reignited backlash from a vocal minority in the community. That evening, a local news station aired a segment featuring Mrs. Harding, who claimed she was being unfairly targeted. I've been working at this school for over 20 years, Mrs. Harding said, her voice trembling as she spoke into the camera. I've always treated the students equally. This is just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. Her words stung, but what followed was worse. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForHarding began circulating, accompanied by posts accusing Amara of fabricating the issue for attention. Some even blamed Zoe for recording the video, calling it an invasion of privacy. The negativity weighed heavily on Amara. She tried to stay focused on the movement, but the hateful comments were hard to ignore. Late at night, she lay in bed, scrolling through the messages on her phone despite Zoe's advice to block the accounts. You're not doing this alone, Zoe reminded her the next day. Let us take some of the weight. The school board meeting. The next major hurdle came in the form of the school board meeting. Held in the gymnasium to accommodate the growing crowd, the meeting was packed with students, parents, teachers, and community members. Amara sat near the front with her parents and coalition members, clutching a folder of notes and proposals. The board president, Mr. Harrington, began the meeting with a summary of the investigation's findings. Our investigation confirmed significant discrepancies in how students were treated in the cafeteria, he said. This is unacceptable, and it is clear that changes must be made. One by one, speakers approached the podium. Parents expressed frustration that such behavior had gone unchecked for so long. Teachers shared stories of wanting to speak out but fearing retaliation. Even the custodial staff weighed in, with Mr. Rodriguez recounting moments he had witnessed over the years. When it was Amara's turn, the room fell silent. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. As she approached the podium, she took a deep breath and began. Good evening, she started, her voice steady despite her nerves. What happened to me was wrong, but it wasn't just about one person. It's about a system that let it happen. A system that didn't protect me or others from being treated unfairly. She paused, scanning the room. We need more than apologies and promises. We need real, lasting change. That's why I'm here tonight, to ask you to commit to the demands we outlined. Not just for me, but for every student who comes after me. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke about the coalition's proposals. Mandatory diversity training, anonymous reporting systems, student representation in decision-making, and regular audits to ensure compliance with equity policies. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Even some of the board members nodded in approval. But Amara knew this was just the beginning. The ripple effect. The school board ultimately adopted many of the coalition's proposals, a victory that sent ripples far beyond Greenfield Middle School. Other schools in the district began examining their policies, inspired by the movement Amara had started. Teachers, administrators, and even students began attending workshops on implicit bias and equity. Amara's story gained national attention, and she was invited to speak at youth leadership conferences and civil rights panels. Each time she stood before a new audience, she shared not just her own experience, but the collective voices of her peers. "This isn't just my story," she said during one event. "It's the story of every student who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or undervalued. And it's about what we can do together to change that." A personal toll. While the movement thrived, Amara struggled with the personal toll of her new role. Balancing schoolwork, friendships, and public appearances was exhausting. Some days, she wanted to retreat, to go back to being an ordinary student. But she also knew the importance of what she was doing. One evening, as she prepared for yet another speech, her father found her in the living room. "You know," he said, sitting beside her, "it's okay to take a break. The fight will still be here when you're ready." Amara looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "What if I let everyone down?" "You won't," he said firmly, "because this fight isn't just yours anymore. You've inspired people to stand with you. That's what real change looks like." The path forward. By the end of the school year, Greenfield Middle School was almost unrecognizable. The cafeteria had undergone a complete overhaul, with new staff and strict quality control measures. Diversity training sessions were held monthly, and the Student Advisory Council became a powerful voice in shaping school policy. But the most significant change was the culture. Students who had once stayed silent about injustices now spoke up, knowing their voices mattered. Teachers who had overlooked biases began addressing them head-on. And Amara, though no longer at the center of every conversation, continued to be a symbol of courage and resilience. On the last day of school, as Amara walked through the hallways, she felt a sense of pride. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, but the progress they had made was undeniable. As she opened her locker for the final time, she found a note tucked inside. It read, "Thank you for standing up. You changed everything." Amara smiled, folding the note and tucking it into her bag. The journey had been hard, but it had been worth it. And she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. Beyond the school walls, summer came to Greenfield, bringing with it warm days and a sense of renewal. For Amara, however, the fight for justice didn't end when the school year closed. If anything, it was only growing. The ripple effects of her story were spreading. Parents from other schools in the district began contacting Amara's family, sharing their children's experiences with bias and discrimination. Local advocacy groups reached out, offering support and asking for her input on broader initiatives. Invitations to speak at events poured in, ranging from youth summits to community forums. Amara felt overwhelmed. Though she was proud of what she had accomplished, the weight of the responsibility was exhausting. At just 14, she was now seen as a leader, an advocate, a voice for those who had long been ignored. And while she was passionate about the cause, she sometimes missed the simplicity of her life before all of this. "I don't know how to handle this," she admitted to Zoe one evening as they sat on her porch. "I'm just one person." Zoe shrugged, tossing a pebble into the yard. "You're one person who started something incredible. You don't have to do everything, Amara, but you can inspire others to help." The statewide summit, Amara's first major speaking engagement outside of Greenfield, was at a statewide youth summit on educational equity. The event, held in the state capitol, brought together students, educators, and activists from across the region. Amara was the youngest speaker on the program, a fact that both intimidated and motivated her. The auditorium was massive, with towering ceilings and rows of seats that seemed to stretch endlessly. As Amara stood backstage, waiting for her turn, her heart pounded. She clutched the note cards she had prepared, though the words on them felt distant and inadequate. "Just speak from your heart," her father said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've lived this. No one knows this story better than you." When her name was announced, the audience erupted into applause. Amara stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd, and then she began. "I'm here today because of something that happened to me," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "But what I've learned is that my story isn't unique. It's part of a bigger pattern, one that's been ignored for too long." She spoke about her experiences, the courage it took to speak up, and the power of collective action. But she also emphasized the need for systemic change, urging the audience to look beyond individual incidents and address the structures that allowed discrimination to persist. "We can't fix what we don't acknowledge," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "It's not enough to say, 'This shouldn't happen.' We have to ask, 'Why does it happen?' and then do the work to change it." When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. Amara's cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and disbelief. She had never imagined her words could have such an impact. Scaling the movement. In the weeks that followed, Amara found herself at the center of a growing movement. With the help of Zoe, Malik, and other members of their coalition, she launched a campaign called Equity in Action, focused on addressing bias and inequality in schools across the state. They created a website where students could share their stories anonymously, providing a platform for voices that had long been silenced. The stories poured in, accounts of racial bias, gender discrimination, and inequitable treatment of students with disabilities. Amara spent hours reading them, her heart breaking with each new tale. But she also felt a renewed sense of purpose. These stories were proof that the problem was widespread, and they strengthened her resolve to keep fighting. The campaign quickly gained traction. Local news outlets covered it, and soon, national media began to take notice. Donations came in from individuals and organizations, allowing Amara and her team to expand their efforts. They organized workshops, created educational materials, and even lobbied state legislators to pass a bill mandating equity training for all school staff. The pushback intensifies. With the movement's success came increased resistance. Conservative groups accused Amara of politicizing education, arguing that her campaign was creating division rather than unity. Social media trolls flooded her campaign's accounts with hateful messages, questioning her motives and spreading false rumors about her family. Amara tried to stay focused, but the negativity took its toll. One evening, after reading a particularly vicious comment thread, she broke down in tears. Her mother found her curled up on the couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "I don't think I can do this anymore," Amara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "People hate me for trying to do the right thing." Denise sat beside her, pulling her into a comforting embrace. "Sweetheart, there will always be people who resist change because it scares them. But remember why you're doing this. Think of all the people you've helped, the kids who feel seen because of you. That's what matters." Her mother's words gave Amara the strength to keep going. She started taking breaks from social media, focusing instead on the tangible progress her campaign was making. And whenever the negativity felt overwhelming, she turned to her coalition for support. A historic victory. The turning point came in late August, when the state legislature voted on the equity training bill. Amara and her team had spent months advocating for the bill, meeting with lawmakers, organizing rallies, and sharing stories from their campaign. The night of the vote, they gathered at Zoe's house, anxiously watching the live stream. When the bill passed, the room erupted into cheers and tears. Amara couldn't believe it. They had done it. Their efforts had led to real, systemic change that would impact students across the state. "This is just the beginning," Zoe said, grinning through her tears. "We're going national next." Amara laughed, though the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel proud of what they had accomplished. The road ahead was still long, but they had proven that change was possible. Looking ahead, as the summer drew to a close, Amara reflected on everything that had happened since that first confrontation in the cafeteria. She thought about the fear she had felt, the courage it had taken to speak up, and the incredible journey that had followed. What started as a single act of defiance had grown into a movement that was reshaping schools and communities. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over Greenfield, Amara felt a sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop fighting for justice. And with the support of her friends, her family, and the countless people she had inspired, she believed they could change the world. A national stage. By the start of the new school year, Amara's life had changed in ways she never imagined. The success of Equity in Action had catapulted her into the national spotlight, making her one of the youngest voices in the fight for educational equity. Media outlets clamored for interviews, advocacy groups invited her to speak at their events, and schools across the country reached out, asking for guidance on addressing bias within their institutions. Despite the excitement, Amara often felt overwhelmed. She was still just a high school freshman, trying to juggle homework, friendships, and family life, while leading a growing movement. The pressure to live up to everyone's expectations weighed heavily on her, and the constant scrutiny sometimes made her question if she was the right person for the job. The challenge of balance. One Friday evening, Amara sat at her desk, staring at a mountain of unfinished homework. Her laptop pinged with new emails. Organizers for a national conference on social justice wanted her to keynote, and a journalist was asking for a follow-up interview. Her phone buzzed with notifications from the Equity in Action social media pages, where messages of support mixed with vitriol. "Amara, dinner's ready," her mother called from the kitchen. "I'll be down in a minute," Amara replied, though she didn't move. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. That night, her parents sat her down for a serious conversation. "Sweetheart," her father said gently, "you're doing amazing work, but you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself too." "I don't want to let anyone down," Amara admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. "What if I take a break and everything falls apart?" Her mother shook her head. "Movements aren't about one person. You've inspired so many people to join this fight. It's okay to step back and let them carry some of the load." With her parents' encouragement, Amara made a difficult decision. She delegated more responsibilities to her coalition. Zoe took over managing their social media accounts, Malik coordinated local events, and Priya spearheaded outreach efforts. Amara focused on the parts of the work that mattered most to her, while making time for school and her own well-being. The turning point. By mid-October, Equity in Action had expanded into a national network, with student-led chapters in over 30 states. The movement's website, which Amara and Zoe had created in their bedrooms, was now a hub for resources, training materials, and personal stories from students across the country. The stories were heartbreaking yet empowering, proof of the widespread need for change. One story, in particular, stuck with Amara. It came from a boy named Marcus in Mississippi, who shared how his teacher had humiliated him in front of his classmates for asking about black inventors during a history lesson. His words echoed Amara's own feelings of isolation and injustice, and they reignited her passion for the work. Determined to help Marcus and others like him, Amara reached out to educational organizations and lawmakers in his area. Her efforts led to a meeting with the state's education department, where she advocated for mandatory cultural competency training for teachers. Though progress was slow, the seeds of change were planted. The national conference. In November, Amara traveled to Washington, D.C. to speak at the National Youth Leadership Summit on social justice. The event was a milestone in her journey, a chance to bring her message to a broader audience and connect with other young activists. The conference was held in a grand auditorium, its walls adorned with banners celebrating youth leadership and activism. Amara stood backstage, her speech clutched in her hands. She had rehearsed it a dozen times, but the sight of the packed audience made her stomach churn. "Just remember," Zoe whispered, giving her a supportive nudge. "You're here because you deserve to be. You've earned this." As Amara stepped onto the stage, a wave of applause greeted her. She took a deep breath and began. "My name is Amara Johnson," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "A year ago, I was just another middle school student trying to navigate life. But then something happened that forced me to confront the reality of injustice, not just in my own life, but in the lives of so many others." She shared her story. From the first day, she noticed the unfair treatment in the cafeteria to the viral video that changed everything. She spoke about the power of collective action, the importance of listening to marginalized voices, and the necessity of holding institutions accountable. "We are not just the leaders of tomorrow," she concluded, her voice rising with conviction. "We are the leaders of today. And together, we can create a world where every student feels seen, valued, and empowered to reach their full potential." The audience rose to its feet, their applause thunderous. Amara felt a surge of pride and gratitude. In that moment, she knew the movement was bigger than herself. It was a force that would continue to grow, fueled by the passion and determination of countless others. A personal milestone. The conference marked a turning point for Amara, both professionally and personally. She realized that while the work was important, it was also okay to celebrate her achievements and allow herself moments of joy. Back home, her coalition threw her a surprise party to celebrate her speech. For the first time in months, Amara let herself relax, laughing and dancing with her friends. Zoe even made a mock Time magazine cover featuring Amara as Person of the Year, which sent the entire group into fits of laughter. "You're not just changing the world," Zoe teased. "You're redefining it, a lasting legacy." By the end of the school year, Equity in Action had made tangible progress. Multiple states had passed legislation requiring equity training for educators, and schools across the country were adopting more inclusive curricula. The movement had become a model for grassroots activism, inspiring other student-led initiatives to address issues like climate change, gun violence, and mental health. For Amara, the journey was far from over. She continued to lead with humility and determination, but she also made time for herself, exploring new hobbies, reconnecting with old friends, and dreaming about her future. She hoped to one day study law or public policy, using her skills to create even greater change. One evening, as she walked through the halls of Greenfield Middle School, now adorned with posters celebrating diversity and equity, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The school, once a place of pain and exclusion, had transformed into a symbol of what was possible when people came together to demand justice. As she opened her locker, she found another note tucked inside. This one simply read, "Because of you, I believe I can make a difference too. Thank you." Amara smiled, folding the note and tucking it into her pocket. The fight wasn't over, but she knew they were on the right path. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and work together, she believed change was inevitable.